To hear this and many more audiobooks not available on YouTube in a podcast feed, please visit the first link in the description below, and thank you for your support. Blood Lies. The evidence that every accusation against Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union in Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands is false. Plus, what really happened, the famine of 1932 to 1933, the Polish operation, the Great Terror, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Soviet invasion of Poland, the Katyn Massacre, the Warsaw Uprising, Stalin's Anti-Semitism. July 2014, by Grover Furr. Acknowledgements and dedication. I would like to express my continuing thanks to the staff of Harry A. Sprague Library, Montclair State University, and especially to Kevin Prendergast and Arthur Hudson, the indefatigable and extremely helpful interlibrary loan librarians. Without their help, I simply could not obtain the many hard-to-find books and articles in many languages that make my research possible. I dedicate this book to Vladimir Lvovich Bobrov of Moscow, Russia, a fine historian, superb translator, a tactful yet sharp critic. He contacted me first in March 1999 to suggest that we begin collaboration on a thorny mystery concerning Soviet history of the Stalin period. When I was hesitant to do so, his patient, persuasive voice convinced me. From there, our collaboration has continued for more than 15 years. We have co-authored a number of articles and, at this point, one book. But everything I have written under my own name owes a great deal to him. Without his collaboration, encouragement, and limitless help, I would not have written this book or any of my previous books and articles. Words cannot fully express my debt to him and my gratitude. Introduction. What is Bloodlands, and why do we need to expose it? In 2010, a book was published that rewrites the history of the Soviet Union, Poland, and Ukraine between the years 1932 and 1945. Its title is Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin. Its author is Timothy Snyder, a professor of Eastern European history at Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, USA. In Bloodlands, Hitler equates the Soviet Union with Nazi Germany and Stalin with Hitler. Footnote. Although Snyder concludes that the Nazis did kill somewhat more people than did the Soviets, he still equates them in a moral sense. End of footnote. Bloodlands is a worldwide success. It has been lavished with praise in dozens of book reviews worldwide, praised as a work of near-perfect history by many critics. Oliver Bullough, Poking with the Human Rights Stick, January 20th, 2012. A selection of the awards and praise can be seen at the special webpage created for this book. Editor's Pick. New York Times Book Review. Die Welt, Book of the Week. NRC Handelsblad, Book of the Week. El País, Book of the Week. NDR, Sachbuch des Monats. New York Times Nonfiction Bestseller. Der Spiegel, Nonfiction Bestseller, Germany. Gazeta Wyborcza, non-fiction bestseller, Poland. Dziennik Polski, bestseller, Poland. Wall Street Journal, #1 hardback history bestseller. It has received high praise not only from predictable right-wing sources, but from liberal outlets like The Nation, New York City. It has been translated into at least 25 languages, including Ukrainian, Polish, Hungarian, Romanian, and all 3 Baltic languages, plus German, French, Spanish, and all 3 Scandinavian languages. And yet, it is a complete fraud, false from beginning to end. It is no exaggeration to say that Snyder's Bloodlands is a litany of falsehoods. That fact is exemplified by the following story. Petro Veldy. During 2011 and 2012, Snyder had a standard book talk on Bloodlands that he delivered many times. Here are some passages transcribed from the YouTube video of that standard talk as delivered in Chicago in 2011. This is a difficult book to introduce, and I'd like to introduce it by way of what's most important to me, namely, the individuals who are its subject. In early 1933, in what was then the Soviet Ukraine, a young man dug his grave. The reason he dug his grave was that he was sure he was going to die of starvation, and he was right. The other reason he dug his own grave was that he knew that once he died, his body would lie in a field beside the road until it was picked up, thrown in the back of a cart, and then dumped with a number of other corpses in a mass grave where there would be no marker. So he knew that he was going to die, but he wished to preserve some element of dignity. So he dug his own grave. Then, when the day came, he went there. Snyder returns to this story at the end of the talk. So 14 million is not just 14 million, but it is 14 million times 1, where that 1 is not just an interchangeable unit, but that 1 is an individual who is different than the individual that came before and the individual who came after. In other words, the book is ultimately about people, and it succeeds insofar as it turns numbers back into people. I can't succeed with a lecture like this, but what I would like to leave you with is the names of the 3 people that I mentioned at the beginning. The young man in Ukraine who dug his own grave is Petro Veldy. This incident is described in Bloodlands on page 47, where it reads as follows. To die of starvation with some sort of dignity was beyond the reach of almost everyone. Petro Veldy showed rare strength when he dragged himself through his village on the day he expected to die. The other villagers asked him where he was going, to the cemetery, to lay himself down. He did not want strangers coming and dragging his body away to a pit, so he had dug his own grave. But by the time he reached the cemetery, another body had filled it. He dug himself another one, lay down, and waited. Snyder's source for this story, note 69, page 466, is as follows. On Veldy, see Kovalenko, Holod, page 132. Snyder spells the man's name Veldy in the text, but Veldy in the footnote. The apostrophe is the transcription of a Ukrainian letter. As we shall see, neither is correct. Kovalenko's book is rare in the United States, so few, if any, readers will check this story. Here is the original, at page 132. I can see it like it happened today. Petro Veldy is going to the village and is carrying in his hands some kind of little bundle. People stand by the village Soviet in the square. Petro is walking in a festive linen shirt, linen trousers, with a tspok in his hands. Footnote. To spoke can mean a stick or cane. Beldy is dressed in his best. The cane would suggest he was elderly or infirm. I have been informed that to spoke can also mean one of several different kinds of digging implements, depending on the specific area in the Ukraine where the word is used. Since Beldy thinks his grave has already been dug, he would probably not bring a digging implement. But then, how does he dig himself another grave? End of footnote. Where are you going? The people ask. To the cemetery. Why? To die. Since I do not want to be carried in a cart, I will go by myself. He went, but the pit that he had dug earlier for himself was already occupied. Petro dug himself another grave, and so died at the cemetery. Snyder has seriously distorted this story. The man's name was not Veldy or Veldi, but Beldy. There is nothing at all about starvation or famine in the story. There is no indication that Beldy is even hungry. The original has nothing about Beldy dragging himself through his village. It simply says that he walked to the village. Snyder's phrase, dragging himself, suggests weakness and is no doubt also intended to suggest starvation and the famine. It permits Snyder to claim that Veldy showed rare strength, but the original suggests nothing of the kind. In it, the villagers standing around the village Soviet, local government headquarters, just wonder what he is doing. In the original, Beldy is carrying a little bundle. This account does not say what was in it. One likely possibility would be food. Snyder omits the bundle altogether. In the original, Beldy is dressed in his holiday clothes. Clearly, he wants to be buried looking his best. Snyder omits this detail. Snyder claims that Beldy did not want strangers coming and dragging his body away to a pit. But there is nothing like this in the original. Kovalenko quotes Beldy as telling some of his fellow villagers that he did not want to be carried away in a cart. Since this is what normally happens when a person dies, the body is taken away in a cart, it means that Beldy has some private reason for not wanting this. In the original, Beldy dies in the cemetery after digging himself a second grave. In Snyder's version, he lay down and waited. In his book Talk, Snyder calls Veldy a young man, but in Snyder's source there is no indication at all of his age. Snyder has falsified this story. He has appropriated it to the famine by adding some details that are not in the original story, while omitting other details that are in it. Even in Kovalenko's book, the story says nothing at all about the cause of the 1932-1933 famine, or anything about any famine at all. But more than that, Snyder's version simply can't be true. This man who, in Snyder's version, was starving to death, starving so badly that he thought he would die on that very day, dug not just one grave, but two. It's no good to dig a shallow grave. The body would probably be dug up by dogs. Digging a deep grave is hard work. It shows exactly the opposite of the lassitude that accompanies slow starvation. But according to Snyder, Veldy was not just starving, he was so far gone that he expected to die that very day. This is impossible. A starving person would not have had the energy to dig these two graves, one some days before, when he must have been starving as well, or why dig the grave, and another on the very day he expected to actually die of starvation. In the original story, he does die. Sure enough, the original story has nothing about starvation, famine, dragging himself, strangers dragging his body to a pit, or even anything that suggests hunger. This story has the form of a legend or folklore, the man who dug his own grave and then waited for death to come. Here is a similar story about a legendary French-Canadian voyager, preserved in a ballad or folk song. Pursued by the Indians through the forest, Callao gradually weakened. He dug his own grave, erected a cross above it, and composed a ballad about his misfortune, which he wrote in blood on birch bark. It was found by those who came to look for him. In any case, no conclusion can be drawn from this rumor or from any rumor. It does not even mention famine or starvation. Even if the original version in Kovalenko's book could somehow be verified, it would not prove anything relevant to Snyder's book. Kovalenko's book. This book was the first collection in Ukraine of testimonies about the famine, under the prodding of the Anti-Communist Memorial Association. Stanislav Kulczycki, a Ukrainian scholar, published an advertisement in the widely circulated newspaper Rural News, in which solicited letters from those who had experienced the famine were requested. He obtained 6,000 replies. According to Ukrainian scholar Hyori Kasyanov. Paradoxically, these questions and the memories they stimulated, regardless of the motives that led to their appearance, could have become one important element in a more adequate reconstruction in the picture of the events of 1932 to 1933. However, the final product, that is, the book created on the basis of the materials thus gathered, testified to the fact that at the turn of the 1990s, the concept of the project had changed fundamentally. For the book, they selected only information from eyewitnesses who painted terrible pictures of people dying in their own homes and related excesses. Though Kovalenko's book, from which Snyder took this story before falsifying it, is hard to find in the USA, it is famous and widely available in Ukraine. In fact, it is famous as the first collection in Ukraine, still at that time a Soviet republic, of stories by those who lived through the famine of 1932 to 1933. The book is so well known that we might expect that the Ukrainian translation of Snyder's book would reprint the original story from Kovalenko's volume, but instead, it translates Snyder's distorted version, even to the point of getting Veldy's name wrong, as Snyder did. Petro Veldy showed rare strength of will, and with his last strength went into the village on the day that he was waiting for death to come for him. His fellow villagers asked him where he was going, to the cemetery to climb into a grave. He did not want strangers to drag his body to a pit, so he dug himself a grave, but when he reached the cemetery, another body was already lying in it. He dug himself another grave, lay in it, and began to wait. Anyone who checks the original version of this story against Snyder's version would see immediately that Snyder has seriously falsified it. It is hard to believe that no one, the translator, the Ukrainian publisher, the Ukrainian historians who work with Snyder, those who arranged for his many talks to Ukrainian audiences in the Ukraine, the US, Canada, has ever done this, but they chose to remain silent about it. The Petro Veldy story is an example of something we will see a great many times in this book. Snyder cannot be trusted to use his sources honestly. When Snyder makes an assertion of fact or fact claim about something involving communists, the Soviet Union, or Stalin, the sources for this fact claim must be double-checked. Upon checking Snyder's source, we normally find either 1, that his source does not support what Snyder's text says or implies that it does, or 2, that the source does reflect what Snyder says in his text, but that source itself is dishonest, in that A, it does not reflect what its own evidence states, or B, its source is yet another secondary source which, when examined, does not support the fact claims given, or C, it cites no evidence at all. In his standard book talk, Snyder names 3 people who were supposedly victims of Hitler and Stalin. He claims that 2 of these were in fact victims of Stalin. One is Petro Veldi. That story is a fabrication. In fact, the falsification goes far beyond the story of this one man. We shall show that there was no Holodomor at all. No deliberate or man-made famine in 1932 to 1933. Snyder's Petro Veldi falsification ought to make us curious about the second victim of Stalin, whom Snyder features at the start of his book talk. He is Adam Solski, one of the Polish officers whose corpse was disinterred by the Nazis at Katyn in April to June 1943. Unlike Beldi, there is no doubt about Solski's identity. He was a real person whose corpse was indeed unearthed by the Germans at the Katyn forest. However, the evidence available today points to German rather than Soviet guilt in the murders of Solski and the other Polish prisoners. We will discuss the Katyn massacre later in this book. The present book presents a detailed, heavily documented critique of Bloodlands. It concludes that virtually all of Snyder's charges and statements about Stalin and the Soviet Union are false. I prove this by checking the evidence Snyder cites, by including, when appropriate, the evidence Snyder's sources cite, and by citing other evidence he omits. Snyder's book has become a Bible for East European neo-Nazis and right-wingers generally. Here is a collection of articles from the Holocaust research site Defending History, collected February 2014. Foreign Minister of Lithuania invokes Timothy Snyder in launch of newest European Union campaign for double genocide. Vytautas Magnus University professor tells Lithuanian Daily that Timothy Snyder is the one great hope. Kaunas professor tells the leading Lithuanian Daily that reburial of the wartime Nazi puppet prime minister reconfirms the drama of Lithuanian history, while attacking the Jews, who allegedly threatened university and national officials with getting hit over the head with a club over the reburial. He also refers to Timothy Snyder as his one great ray of hope. Book event for Lithuanian edition of Bloodlands at Lithuanian Foreign Ministry. Historians use the occasion to besmirch Holocaust survivors who joined the anti-Nazi partisans and to cement red equals brown equation. Professor tells Lithuanian radio audience that it's not all hopeless, thanks to Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands. At a symposium of historians speaking for a wider Lithuanian audience, one accomplished professor put on the record when discussing the difficulties in selling the revisionist history to the West, but it's not all hopeless. Timothy Snyder has written an important book called Bloodlands. Some Holocaust researchers have appealed to Snyder to dissociate himself from the political uses of his book. List of experts cited during preparation of Lithuanian Parliament-sponsored film glorifying the local Holocaust killers. Quote, "For the record, I do sincerely regret the inclusion of Professor Snyder's name in the planning stages of a 2011 ultranationalist film, supported by the Lithuanian Parliament, which glorifies the Holocaust perpetrating LAF, Lithuanian Activist Front, as freedom fighters. Its Vilnius premiere on 22nd June 2011 included swastika-stamped souvenir tickets. Report on the event, review of the film by the longtime editor of the last Jewish newspaper in Lithuania. I respectfully call on Professor Snyder to publicly disavow and or sever any links to the planning for the film, which would have simply been naive, and to now condemn the final product as the product of ultranationalist anti-Semitic, East European Holocaust revisionism designed to glorify the perpetrators and deflect attention from local participation in the Holocaust in the making of state-sponsored revisionist history." End quote. Good luck with that. There is no way that Snyder is not completely aware of the political tendency of Bloodlands and whom the falsehoods and distortions in his book benefit. The page in question is titled East European Nationalist Abuse of Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, but it is not an abuse at all. This is in fact the political tenor of Bloodlands. The East European nationalists and neo-Nazis have understood it all too well. I have specialized in researching the history of the Soviet Union during the Stalin years, particularly the crucial decade between 1930 and the Nazi invasion of June 22, 1941. I first became acquainted with Snyder's research some years ago when studying the Volhynian massacres, the mass murders by Ukrainian nationalist forces of 50,000 to 100,000 or more Polish civilians in the western part of the Ukrainian SSR, then under German occupation. In the 1990s, Snyder published the only scholarly studies in the English language of these horrifying slaughters, although his anti-communism and a tendency to minimize the crimes of anti-communist nationalists are already evident in these articles. Several years ago, a friend and colleague asked me what I thought about one of Snyder's essays in the influential American journal The New York Review of Books. There, Snyder asserted, without evidence of any kind, that the famine of 1932 to 1933 was man-made and deliberately directed by Stalin to kill and to terrorize Ukrainians. Serious students of Soviet history have long known that there is, in fact, no evidence of any Holodomor, any deliberate famine. This has been described as a fiction by mainstream Western anti-communist scholars since at least Robert Conquest's book, Harvest of Despair, was published in 1987. Footnote. See Jeff Complin, In Search of a Soviet Holocaust. A 55-year-old famine feeds the right. Village Voice, New York, January 12, 1988. End of footnote. Conquest himself has withdrawn his accusation that the famine was deliberate. We discuss this matter thoroughly in chapters 1 through 3 of the present book. It is clear to any objective student of Soviet history that Snyder is wrong about the famine, but non-specialists, like my friend and colleague, do not know it. So, I began collecting Snyder's essays. He publishes widely in intellectual and semi-popular journals, where he is assumed to be an expert on Eastern European history. It soon became clear to me that Snyder's book gives a false account not only of the famine of 1932 to 1933, but virtually every point of Soviet history with which I was familiar. It is the professional responsibility of historians to acknowledge disputes and disagreements in the fields they research, but Snyder never informs his readers about the scholarly disputes that exist over many of these issues, whether it be the famine, the Azovshochina, or Great Terror, the Katyn Massacre, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Partisan War, the Warsaw Ghetto Revolt, the Warsaw Uprising, or others. Without exception, Snyder repeats an anti-Soviet, anti-communist position without any qualification. It is not only that many statements in Snyder's books are factually false. There are so many such false statements that they could not be the result of carelessness. Moreover, there is a systematic quality to all of them. Every one is tendentiously anti-communist. I realized that I would have to systematically check every factual statement about the Soviet leadership or Soviet actions that had a negative tendency, every allegation of a crime or an atrocity. In April 2012, Snyder was invited to speak at a Holocaust commemoration event at Keene University of New Jersey, not far from my own university. I wrote a two-sided flyer detailing a small number of Snyder's most brazen falsehoods and distributed 100 copies of it at the talk. The flyer was well received by the audience of students who had been required to attend and others interested in the Holocaust. I am pleased that the present book, in which Snyder's falsehoods about Soviet history are exposed and refuted in a more detailed and complete manner, is now available to readers. Like any work of history, Bloodlands contains a great many assertions of facts, statements that affirm that something occurred. The present book examines and checks all of the assertions of fact that have a clearly anti-Soviet or anti-communist tenor. It does not verify other of Snyder's fact claims, in particular Snyder's statements about Nazi Germany. There are a great many experts on the history of Nazi Germany. If Snyder has made any factual errors in his discussion of Nazi crimes, it is unlikely that this will escape notice. My working hypothesis is as follows. I would find that many of Snyder's anti-Soviet assertions or fact claims were false, not supported by the evidence Snyder cites, or indeed by any other evidence. My further hypothesis was that the secondary sources Snyder cites in support of these statements would either not support Snyder's fact claims, or would themselves be fallacious, unsupported by the evidence, if any, that they cited. My research has fully corroborated both of these hypotheses. In fact, I discovered that my initial hypothesis was too cautious. I have found not that many, but that virtually all of Snyder's fact claims of an anti-Soviet and or anti-communist tendency are false. In this book, I present the results of that research. Organization of this book. The chapters in this book adhere to the following method of presentation. After an introductory section, I quote every passage in which Snyder makes a fact claim that accuses the Soviet Union or one of its leaders, e.g. Stalin, or communists generally of some crime, or that tends to reflect negatively upon Stalin or Soviet actions. Then, the evidence Snyder cites to support his statements, normally found in a footnote, is identified and, where possible, reproduced. Then, each of the sources in that footnote, whether primary or usually secondary, is checked and verified in order to assess whether that source provides support for Snyder's fact claim. In the case of secondary sources, I have checked further for the primary sources that these secondary sources use. This is essential because the fact that one historian agrees with another does not constitute evidence. Only primary sources are evidence. Accordingly, in each instance where Snyder cites another secondary source in his footnote, I have obtained and studied the primary source evidence upon which that secondary source relies. This procedure continues until we reach the primary sources upon which all the other secondary sources are based, or until we discover that in reality there is no primary source evidence supporting the series of fact claims, which are thereby revealed to be falsifications. This method is essential in order to verify Snyder's fact claims concerning Soviet crimes, or as it turns out, in order to demonstrate that they are false virtually without exception. Whenever possible, a summary title or subheading has been given to each of the passages from Snyder's book. The purpose of this subheading is to aid the reader in deciding whether he or she wants to examine these fact claims or wishes to pick and choose, examining some and passing over others. In the case of the most famous alleged Soviet or Stalinist crimes, the 1932 to 1933 famine, the Azovshchina, or Great Terror, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, the Katyn Massacre, the Warsaw Uprising of 1944, and Stalin's alleged anti-Semitism, I have preceded my investigation of Snyder's account with a section titled What Really Happened. To hear this and many more audiobooks not available on YouTube in a podcast feed, please visit the first link in the description below, and thank you for your support.